Passengers and crew of an Air New Zealand sightseeing flight to Antarctica are capturing their first glimpses of the continent. Unbeknownst to all 257 on board, it will also be their last. Planes should be flying over the low-lying McMurdo Sound. Instead, a deadly navigation error has put the aircraft on a collision course with the 12,500-foot Mount Erebus. 6 seconds from disaster, the ground proximity warning system goes off, indicating an imminent crash with terrain. The pilots attempt to go around. But it's too late. They crash into the side of the mountain, leaving no survivors. At the time, the accident was aviation's 4th deadliest, and led to widespread anger in the tiny nation of New Zealand and global fear about the DC-10's safety. At first glance, the crash was caused by nothing more than simple pilot error. But the investigation proved to be among the most controversial in history. The airline would be accused of a widespread conspiracy to hide their involvement, while the political fallout would bring down a CEO and a prime minister. This is the story of one of the most controversial accidents of all time, Air New Zealand Flight 901, better known as the Mount Erebus Disaster. Antarctica is a vast and untouched wilderness, a continent shrouded in mystery and crowned with icy peaks. Yet even in this unforgiving expanse, humanity has sought to explore. The history of Antarctica is one marked by daring expeditions and the quest for the unknown. For early explorers, like Sir Ernest Shackleton, this meant dangerous multi-year voyages in sailboats. By the 1950s, famed explorer Sir Edmund Hillary was following up his ascent of Everest by driving snowcats around the continent. And by the 1970s, the Boeing 747 and McConnell Douglas DC-10 jumbo jets allowed Qantas and Air New Zealand to fly sightseeing flights to Antarctica. For the first time, the continent could be seen by regular, everyday people. Demand for such flights was fierce. Passengers would pay thousands, while crews would have to bid for their seats, with only the most experienced among them getting selected for a single flight. For the November 28, 1979 flight, this honor was given to Captain Jim Collins, First Officer Greg Casson, and Flight Engineer Gordon Brooks. 2 other crew members were also selected, but were off duty at the time of the incident. The 3 primary crew members combined for 30,000 hours of flight experience, including 7,000 on the DC-10, though only Brooks had flown to Antarctica before. In a tragic piece of irony, Hillary himself was scheduled to be the flight's guide before being replaced last minute by Peter Mulgrew. On November 28 at 8 a.m., the flight took off from Auckland International Airport, picked up passengers in Christchurch, and then continued non-stop to Antarctica. Now this is when things started to get a bit complicated. According to the originally approved flight plan, the plane would enter the continent via a figure-8 maneuver, then by flying over Mount Erebus directly, descending to no lower than 16,000 feet, allowing it to clear the 12,500-foot mountain. From there, the plane was to continue towards the McMurdo non-directional beacon. However, that flight plan was never once flown, nor was it given to the crew. Instead, a computerization error led to all previous flights following a more westerly route over McMurdo Sound, where the minimum safe altitude was just 6,000 feet. Further, pilots had generally been approved to descend to 2,000 or 3,000 feet by the nearby McMurdo Air Traffic Control. Now obviously that wasn't great, but it also wasn't dangerous, as McMurdo Sound is at sea level. But in the preceding flight, Captain Leslie Simpson finally noticed a discrepancy between the McMurdo beacon waypoint and its actual location, and inputted this error into the ground computer. However, instead of updating the waypoint location, the computer rerouted the entire flight to something more closely resembling its original flight plan, with a direct course over Mount Erebus. What's worse, Collins' crew was not informed of the change, and they still believed they were safe to fly at 6,000 feet or lower. But the challenge didn't end there. The usual checks and balances, essential for averting disaster, were notably absent. The aircraft's reliance on an inertial navigation system, a method for recalculating its position based on airspeed and heading, meant that it operated under a crucial assumption: that the initial position was accurate. This assumption led the system to believe the aircraft was over McMurdo Sound, aligning with the erroneous earlier flight plan. Compounding the issue, McMurdo ADC radar lacked precise position data for the aircraft, leaving them unable to intervene and correct the crew's course. Which brings us to the aircraft's final approach towards Antarctica. Believing they are flying towards McMurdo Sound, ATC approves a descent to 2,000 feet. From here, the crew somehow struggles to establish visual contact with Mount Erebus, even going so far as to call Mulgrew into the flight deck to help. Adding to this mystery are the passenger photos and videos, which show clear visibility for miles. But eventually, after several minutes, the crew believe they spot Mount Erebus miles west and continue their approach accordingly. However, they are dangerously mistaken. They are really seeing a rare weather phenomenon known as sector whiteout. Generally confined to the polar regions, this occurs when snow and ice of the ground visually merge with the sky, making them appear as one, and it makes it impossible to distinguish different landmarks. To the crew, this means that the massive Mount Erebus appears as nothing more than an endless expanse of flat snow and ice. Completely oblivious, the plane continues towards the mountain. Their only warning is the collision avoidance system, which sounds an alarm just 6 seconds before disaster. The crew attempt a go-around maneuver, but it's too late. Passengers are so unaware of their imminent danger that they continue recording videos and snapping photos to the last minute, even providing us with what is believed to be a moment of impact photo. At 12:59 p.m., the plane collides with Mount Erebus, instantly killing all 257 people on board. The immediate aftermath was characterized by intense public pressure, fueled by several factors. Above all else, the scale of the accident was staggering. At the time, it was the 4th deadliest aviation disaster in history, and it ranked as the 2nd largest peacetime disaster in New Zealand's history. With a population of just 3 million in 1978, a significant proportion of Kiwis personally knew someone affected by the tragedy. Adding to the urgency was the DC-10's troubled history. Just a few months earlier, the fatal crash of American Airlines Flight 191 had led to its temporary grounding. Public confidence in the aircraft had plummeted, and people were demanding swift answers. This task fell on the shoulders of New Zealand's Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, Ron Chippendale. Despite the remote crash site, evidence was surprisingly abundant. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were swiftly recovered, both fully intact. And given the nature of the sightseeing flight, most passengers carried cameras, resulting in the wealth of developed photos and film that we've seen thus far. In a remarkably short span, just 6 months after the accident, the investigation released its findings. The primary cause was attributed to the crew's decision to descend below 6,000 feet without adequate positional awareness. In other words, pilot error. But this finding was heavily questioned by the public, who felt the airline was to blame, and the evidence seemed to support this theory as well. The descent below 6,000 feet was discussed with the pilots in a pre-flight briefing, and even Air New Zealand's own promotional material showed planes regularly descending to a lower altitude. In response to this public pressure, the New Zealand government announced that Justice Peter Mahone would lead his own inquiry into the incident. The so-called Mahone Report unequivocally absolved the pilots of all responsibility. He also sounded off on Chippendale's investigation, saying that it lacked rigor while featuring numerous errors and knowledge gaps. Specifically, he highlighted its failure to consider the impact of the flight plan changes and Air New Zealand's inadequate training for dealing with sector whiteout conditions. But Mahone did not stop there. He further accused the airline of participating in an elaborate conspiracy to conceal the truth about how their administrative blunders caused the crash. He famously wrote, "No judicial officer ever wishes to be compelled to say that he has listened to evidence which is false. But in this case, The palpably false sections of evidence which I heard could not have been the result of a mistake or faulty recollection. They were very clearly part of an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders. I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies. Mahone's findings only led to more public outrage and debate. Over the years following the tragic events of Air New Zealand Flight 901, the aftermath unfolded with legal battles, public opinion shifts, and lingering questions about accountability. Legally, Air New Zealand came out on top. In 1983, a New Zealand Court of Appeals delivered a unanimous ruling that relieved Air New Zealand of significant financial responsibility, rejecting Justice Peter Mahone's order for the airline to cover most of the inquiry costs. Meanwhile, the Privy Council acknowledged false information was provided to Chippendale's team, but dismissed Mahone's claims of a company-wide conspiracy, calling it inconceivable, and described such accusations as a breach of natural justice. Public opinion, however, remained much more sympathetic to Justice Mahone in his inquiry. The Mahone Report was officially tabled in Parliament in 1999, forever enshrining it into the public record. Captain Gordon Vett, a key contributor, was awarded the Officer of the New Zealand Order of Merit, while Justice Mahone received the Jim Collins Memorial Award for his exceptional contributions to air safety. Meanwhile, while both the airline and the government continued to deny conspiracy claims, public pressure eventually forced CEO Maury David to resign and played a major role in Prime Minister Robert Muldoon's loss in the 1983 election. Decades later, Air New Zealand finally issued an apology for inadequate support to affected families, while Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern apologized on the airline's behalf for, quote, failing in its duty of care. So it's safe to say that the debate between Mahone and Chippendale echoed through New Zealand's political landscape. While politicians assert their innocence, public sentiment continues to favor Mahone, who became a hero to many. But where does the truth really lie? Well, that's not easy to say, and definitive answers remain elusive. No smoking gun has ever emerged to prove the alleged conspiracy. Interviews during the investigations may have been tainted by nothing more than individual motives, while Chippendale's errors may simply reflect the agency's limited experience. But regardless of conspiracy speculations, Air New Zealand's actions resulted in 257 deaths. Most experts today agree on the airline's fault for the flight plan change and inadequate training, thus absolving the pilots of all responsibility. Yet, amidst the controversy, crucial discussions on safety improvements were overshadowed. The root cause of issues, like the last-minute flight plan change, remain unexplained. To his credit, Chippendale proposed actionable safety recommendations, many of which are still in effect today. For example, the requirement to carry emergency locator beacons, restrictions on the number of people on the flight deck, and the rerouting of aircraft away from active volcanoes. Most notably, the accident prompted a pause in Antarctic commercial operations as the industry recognized the need for safer technology before resuming such ventures. It's easy to believe that a powerful corporation committed an elaborate conspiracy in an attempt to cover up the true cause of 257 deaths. Whether or not that really happened, we'll probably never know. But that doesn't mean that the investigations and follow-up were failures. The purpose of investigating air crashes transcends assigning blame. It aims to learn from mistakes and make flying safer for everyone. And despite the controversies and unknowns, the tragedy of Flight 901 did just that.